It started when I was 6 years old. I was in school. It was the middle of a reading lesson, and I needed to pee badly. At that age, actually, a fair few kids still wet themselves, and I always got paranoid about embarrassing myself in public like that. I stuck my hand up and told Mrs. Zebby that I needed to use the bathroom. After the usual speech about how I should have gone at break, she gave me the key to the disabled access toilet, as it was the closest one to my classroom. It was the middle of fifth period, and the corridors were empty and seemed cavernous to me. I was a short, scrawny thing back then. I sometimes had trouble with doors, especially unlocking them, and I fumbled for a good minute or two in trying to get the blasted thing open. Anyway, as I sat on my porcelain throne, there came a knocking at the door. "Someone's in here," I called, disgruntled at this disturbance. There came a pause, then the knocking resumed. It was faster now, more determined. "Wait a minute." The knocking slowed and a voice replied, "Let me in. I need to come inside." The speaker's tone was thin and reedy, an adult I didn't recognize. I may have been 6, but I also had a fairly good understanding of bathroom etiquette, mainly that you didn't let more than one person into an area only slightly larger than a cupboard. "Go away!" The knocking intensified again until it was a frantic drum beat just a few feet from me and out of sight. I heard the voice shouting something, growing more and more desperate. "Let me in. Just open the door, please." I was terrified by that point. The hammering and yelling was so loud, and yet nobody had come to investigate it. Eventually, my teacher came to find me, angry because I had been gone almost half an hour. When I refused to open the door to let her in, she got a spare key from the receptionist, and then took me to the headmaster's office and called my parents. I was suspended for the rest of the week. I never told anyone what happened. It was a few weeks before my next encounter with this phenomenon. I had just celebrated my 7th birthday, and my family were having a barbecue in my honor. It was a gloriously sunny day, but as soon as we'd set everything up in the allotments behind our house, the coal refused to light. My dad asked me to go and get some fire starters from the shed in the front garden. It was pretty cramped inside, and I wouldn't fit all the way, so I just opened it up, stood on tiptoes to reach the shelf holding my objective, then shut the door. As I turned away, a frantic knocking hit the other side of the door. "Open up, I need to come through." This voice was not the one I'd heard the month before. It was deeper, more brooding and angry. I said nothing and hurried away. I had no idea what was happening, but it frightened me. As I walked away, there came a final thump, like a fist being slammed against wood, and I heard his voice again. "You little bastard. I'll rip your fucking teeth out. Let me through." I ran back to my party and spent the rest of the day glancing over my shoulder. As you might have guessed by now, there were a lot of these voices. I count at least 30 total. Every month or so I used to get them, pleading to be let through doors. Almost always, it would be immediately after I shut the door behind me, as though these strange entities had been following me. I never told anyone, but to be honest, I kinda just got used to it. It always made me jump, and some of the voices would make me feel uneasy, but I knew that I was safe so long as I did not open the door. Some of the voices I got used to the extent that I even named them. There was one which always used to appear at my front door at home. We have frosted glass, and I could see a silhouette of an average-sized man wearing a cap of some kind. He never spoke, but occasionally would push envelopes containing blank pieces of paper through the letterbox. I called him the postman. He was one of the more unsettling ones. If I tried to speak to him, he would look up sharply, then begin knocking. I generally left the postman alone. 20 years on, and I have retained as much normality as possible. I have plenty of friends, and I even have an on and off relationship with a girl I met last year. Not bad for a guy who wakes up in the middle of the night and listens intently to noises you can't hear on the other side of the door. Yeah, my buddies think I'm strange and kooky, but they put up with it. They're all great. I'll miss them. You see, things have started to get strange. Well, stranger than usual, I suppose. 3 weeks ago I awoke, sweating and crying, though I do not know why. My dream had been, from what I recall, fairly normal, when a huge shadow had abruptly fallen over everything. Literally, the second I opened my eyes, there came the knocking at my bedroom door. Not just normal knocking, though. This was truly frantic. "Who goes there?" I yelled. "Please, help us," it replied. I was surprised. It was the sadistic, angry voice that I remember from my father's shed on my 7th birthday, but it seemed genuinely sincere. There was a pained tone to it, too, as though the speaker were grievously wounded. I actually found myself pulling back the sheets to get up, but I hesitated. I had never before been tempted to open the door. I suppose, as a child, I had so rigorously drummed into my head the idea that whatever lay beyond was evil that it was just common sense. To be quite honest, I came very close to letting the thing into my room that morning. I held out in the end. It got worse. Just 2 days later, I was in my local corner shop. I'd just paid for a bottle of milk and a newspaper when a great force slammed against the shop door. Simultaneously, a voice began screaming a long, keening squeal of pain. I whirled to face the door, but there were so many flyers plastered over the glass that I could only just make out the shape of a woman on the other side, slapping her palms against the window. The shopkeeper stared at me as though I were crazy. In the end, I asked if he had a bathroom I could use, murmured some half-thought-out excuse, and hid there for 10 minutes until the screaming stopped. There were 4 more incidents between then and now, a mixture of screams and tearful begging. The postman stopped by yesterday, too. He knocked politely before sliding his usual letter through the letterbox. Then another, a total of 10 plain brown envelopes. The postman waited for a few minutes, knocking occasionally, and then he left me alone. Each letter contained a sheet of A4 paper, but somebody had taken a black pen to the pages, scribbling and shading them with such vigor that there were large tears around the center, and the edges were frayed. I shoved them back into their envelopes and tried to put it from my mind. Earlier, my bedroom door shook violently. It wasn't a scream or a howl or a roar that I heard, though. It was just crying. Dozens and dozens of voices, sobbing quietly. Another blow struck my door. Plaster flaked from the walls and twirled to the carpet. Still no pleas or bargaining, just sobbing. Crash. I jumped up from my chair. Crash. A hairline crack split the frame of the door in one corner. My phone began to ring, and I heard a sharp rapping at the glass of my window, behind the curtains. I tried answering the phone, but it was simply yet more voices crying. Not even sobbing, though, more like bawling in terror and anguish. I hung up, but it kept ringing, so I took the battery out. I have shoved most of my furniture against the door and window. It has been 3 hours since this latest attempt at entry began. The battering has not abated, nor has the crying. I'm fairly sure that my door won't hold much longer. As for my mediocre barricade, it could be swept aside in 2 minutes. I find myself faced with the very real possibility of death, so I'm writing this memoir of sorts, just in case something does happen. Crash. What do they want? Crash. Do they even want to hurt me? Crash. They seemed fearless, even malicious before. Crash. What could have driven them to this? Crash. Maybe I should open the door. Crash. Maybe I should let them in. Silence fell. I realized that even the crying had ceased. For a whole minute I sat there. Then I got up and hurried to my door, eager to escape this claustrophobic situation. Perhaps I'd go outside, where I could be far away from any doors, and from the damned knocking. I pulled away my barricade and turned the handle. Locked. Kneeling, I peered through the keyhole. Beyond my bedroom door was not the corridor that I remembered, but another room, some kind of library or classroom, I think. It seemed unoccupied, but for one kid, sitting and reading with his back to me. I banged on the door. "Hey kid, let me out, okay?" He glanced over his shoulder. "Yeah, over here. Could you open the door, please?" "I can't. I'm in detention. I'm not supposed to talk to anyone. Go away." He turned from me. Confused and exasperated, I began to stand up. A loud bang shattered the silence once more. I realized it sounded like a fist being pounded against glass. My window. I heard it again. But this was not the frantic knocking of somebody wanting to get inside. This was not even an attempt to break in. Whatever was beyond the curtain and glass knew I was inside. It knew I was frightened. In the most predatory and sadistic way possible, it wanted me to be afraid. I turned back to the door and began hammering on it frantically. "Hey, let me in, okay? I really need you to open the door." Russian researchers in the late 1940s kept 5 people awake for 15 days using an experimental gas-based stimulant. They were kept in a sealed environment to carefully monitor their oxygen intake, so the gas didn't kill them, since it was toxic in high concentrations. This before closed-circuit cameras, so they had only microphones and 5-inch thick glass porthole-sized windows into the chamber to monitor them. The chamber was stocked with books, cots to sleep on but no bedding, running water and toilet, and enough dried food to last all 5 for over a month. The test subjects were political prisoners deemed enemies of the state during World War II. Everything was fine for the first 5 days. The subjects hardly complained, having been promised falsely that they would be freed if they submitted to the test and did not sleep for 30 days. Their conversations and activities were monitored, and it was noted that they continued to talk about increasingly traumatic incidents in their past, and the general tone of their conversations took on a darker aspect after the 4-day mark. After 5 days, they started to complain about the circumstances and events that lead them to where they were, and started to demonstrate severe paranoia. They stopped talking to each other and began alternately whispering to the microphones and one-way mirrored portholes. Oddly, they all seemed to think they could win the trust of the experimenters by turning over their comrades, the other subjects in captivity with them. At first, the researchers suspected this was an effect of the gas itself. After 9 days, the first of them started screaming. He ran the length of the chamber, repeatedly yelling at the top of his lungs for 3 hours straight. He continued attempting to scream, but was only able to produce occasional squeaks. The researchers postulated that he had physically torn his vocal cords. The most surprising thing about this behavior is how the other captives reacted to it, or rather didn't react to it. They continued whispering to the microphones until the second of the captives started to scream. The 2 non-screaming captives took the books apart, smeared page after page with their own feces, and pasted them calmly over the glass portholes. The screaming promptly stopped. So did the whispering to the microphones. After 3 more days passed, the researchers checked the microphones hourly to make sure they were working, since they thought it impossible that no sound could be coming with 5 people inside. The oxygen consumption in the chamber indicated that all 5 must still be alive. In fact, it was the amount of oxygen 5 people would consume at a very heavy level of strenuous exercise. On the morning of the 14th day, the researchers did something they said they would not do to get a reaction from the captives. They used the intercom inside the chamber, hoping to provoke any response from the captives they were afraid were either dead or vegetables. They announced, "We are opening the chamber to test the microphones. Step away from the door and lie flat on the floor, or you will be shot. Compliance will earn one of you your immediate freedom." To their surprise, they heard a single phrase in a calm voice response: "We no longer want to be freed." Debate broke out among the researchers and then the military forces funding the research. Unable to provoke any more response using the intercom, it was finally decided to open the chamber at midnight on the 15th day. The chamber was flushed of the stimulant gas and filled with fresh air, and immediately voices from the microphones began to object. 3 different voices began begging, as if pleading for the life of loved ones, to turn the gas back on. The chamber was opened and soldiers sent in to retrieve the test subjects. They began to scream louder than ever, and so did the soldiers when they saw what was inside. 4 of the 5 subjects were still alive, although no one could rightly call the state that any of them in life. The food rations past day 5 had not been so much as touched. There were chunks of meat from the dead test subject's thighs and chest stuffed into the drain in the center of the chamber, blocking the drain and allowing 4 inches of water to accumulate on the floor. Precisely how much of the water on the floor was actually blood was never determined. All 4 surviving test subjects also had large portions of muscle and skin torn away from their bodies. The destruction of flesh and exposed bone on their fingertips indicated that the wounds were inflicted by hand, not with teeth, as the researchers initially thought. Closer examination of the position and angles of the wounds indicated that most, if not all of them, were self-inflicted. The abdominal organs below the ribcage of all 4 test subjects had been removed, while the heart, lungs, and diaphragm remained in place. The skin and most of the muscles attached to the ribs had been ripped off, exposing the lungs through the ribcage. All the blood vessels and organs remained intact. They had just been taken out and laid on the floor, fanning out around the eviscerated but still living bodies of the subjects. The digestive tract of all 4 could be seen to be working, digesting food. It quickly became apparent that what they were digesting was their own flesh that they had ripped off and eaten over the course of days. Most of the soldiers were Russian special operatives at the facility, but still many refused to return to the chamber to remove the test subjects. They continued to scream to be left in the chamber and alternately begged and demanded that the gas be turned back on, lest they fall asleep. To everyone's surprise, the test subjects put up a fierce fight in the process of being removed from the chamber. One of the Russian soldiers died from having his throat ripped out. Another was gravely injured by having his testicles ripped off and an artery in his leg severed by one of the subject's teeth. Another 5 of the soldiers lost their lives if you count ones that committed suicide in the weeks following the incident. In the struggle, one of the 4 living subjects had his spleen ruptured and he bled out almost immediately. The medical researchers attempted to sedate him, but this proved impossible. He was injected with more than 10 times the human dose of a morphine derivative and still fought like a cornered animal, breaking the ribs and arm of one doctor. When heart was seen to beat for a full 2 minutes after he had bled out to the point, there was more air in his vascular system than blood. Even after it stopped, he continued to scream and flail for another 3 minutes, struggling to attack anyone in reach, and just repeating the word "more" over and over, weaker and weaker, until he finally fell silent. The surviving 3 test subjects were heavily restrained and moved to a medical facility, the 2 with intact vocal cords continuously begging for the gas, demanding to be kept awake. The most injured of the 3 was taken the only surgical operating room that the facility had. In the process of preparing the subject to have his organs placed back within his body, it was found that he was effectively immune to the sedative they had given him to prepare him for the surgery. He fought furiously against his restraints when the anesthetic gas was brought out to put him under. He managed to tear most of the way through a 4-inch wide leather strap on one wrist, even through the weight of a 200-pound soldier holding that wrist as well. It took only a little more anesthetic than normal to put him under, and the instant his eyelids fluttered and closed, his heart stopped. In the autopsy of the test subject that died on the operating table, it was found that his blood had triple the normal level of oxygen. His muscles that were still attached to his skeleton were badly torn, and he had broken 9 bones in his struggle to not be subdued. Most of them were from the force his own muscles had exerted on them. The second survivor had been the first of the group of 5 to start screaming. His vocal cords destroyed, he was unable to beg or object to surgery, and he only reacted by shaking his head violently in disapproval when the anesthetic gas was brought near him. He shook his head yes when someone suggested, reluctantly, they try the surgery without anesthetic, and did not react for the entire 6-hour procedure of replacing his abdominal organs and attempting to cover them with what remained of his skin. The surgeon presiding stated repeatedly that it should be medically possible for the patient to still be alive. One terrified nurse assisting the surgery stated that she had seen the patient's mouth curl into a smile several times whenever his eyes met hers. When the surgery ended, the subject looked at the surgeon and began to wheeze loudly, attempting to talk while struggling. Assuming this must be something of drastic importance, the surgeon had a pen and pad fetched so the patient could write his message. It was simple: keep cutting. The other 2 test subjects were given the same surgery, both without anesthetic as well, although they had to be injected with a paralytic for the duration of the operation. The surgeon found it impossible to perform the operation, while the patients laughed continuously. Once paralyzed, the subjects could only follow the attending researchers with their eyes. The paralytic cleared their system in an abnormally short period of time, and they were soon trying to escape their bonds. The moment they could speak, they were again asking for the stimulant gas. The researchers tried asking why they had injured themselves, why they had ripped out their own guts, and why they wanted to be given the gas again. Only one response was given: I must remain awake. All 3 subjects' restraints were reinforced, and they were placed back into the chamber, awaiting determination as to what should be done with them. The researchers, facing the wrath of their military benefactors for having failed the stated goals of their project, considered euthanizing the surviving subjects. The commanding officer, an ex-KGB, instead saw potential and wanted to see what would happen if they were put back on the gas. The researchers strongly objected, but were overruled. In preparation for being sealed in the chamber again, the subjects were connected to an EEG monitor and had their restraints padded for long-term confinement. To everyone's surprise, all 3 stopped struggling the moment it was let slip that they were going back on the gas. It was obvious that at this point, all 3 were putting up a great struggle to stay awake. One of subjects that could speak was humming loudly and continuously. The mute subject was straining his legs against the leather bonds with all his might. First left, then right, then left again for something to focus on. The remaining subject was holding his head off his pillow and blinking rapidly. Having been the first to be wired for EEG, most of the researchers were monitoring his brainwaves in surprise. They were normal most of the time, but sometimes flatlined inexplicably. It looked as if he were repeatedly suffering brain death before returning to normal. As they focused on paper scrolling out of the brainwave monitor, only one nurse saw his eyes slip shut at the same moment his head hit the pillow. His brainwaves immediately changed to that of deep sleep, then flatlined for the last time as his heart simultaneously stopped. The only remaining subject that could speak started screaming to be sealed in now. His brainwaves showed the same flat lines as one who had just died from falling asleep. The commander gave the order to seal the chamber with both subjects inside, as well as 3 researchers. One of the named 3 immediately drew his gun and shot the commander point blank between the eyes, then turned the gun on the mute subject and blew his brains out as well. He pointed his gun at the remaining subject, still restrained to a bed as the remaining members of the medical and research team fled the room. I won't be locked in here with these things. Not with you, he screamed at the man strapped to the table. What are you? He demanded. I must know, the subject smiled. Have you forgotten so easily? The subject asked. We are you. We are the madness that lurks within you all, begging to be free at every moment in your deepest animal mind. We are what you hide from in your beds every night. We are what you sedate into silence and paralysis when you go to the nocturnal haven where we cannot tread. The researcher paused, then aimed at the subject's heart and fired. The EEG flatlined as the subject weakly choked out, so nearly free. I cannot describe to you how I feel right now. What I'm experiencing is so detached from the normal. I'm almost convinced I've finally gone insane. Almost. My wife, Bia, died during childbirth. She was gorgeous, funny, intelligent, stubborn. A woman whose laugh was so loud, eating in restaurants was a challenge. A woman whose stare was so intense, it made my hands shake. I lost her as she gave birth to our daughter, Sam. Of course I could have resented Sam for taking away what was once mine in a way nothing else can be, for taking what was so truly and utterly pure. But I didn't. I knew Bia wouldn't have wanted any resentment. She wouldn't have wanted our only child to have a life ruined by hate. But this isn't about grief. This isn't about the physical sucker punch of losing forever something you loved. This is about something far more sinister. My daughter was lively, always running and screaming, leaping up and down the climbing frame, causing havoc in her classes. So for her 6th birthday, a trip with friends to the movies had left her so pent up with energy, I could barely keep up with her as she dipped and dodged between people on the pavement. She'd occasionally turn back through the sea of people and shout, "Daddy, come on," in a tone that was almost petulant. I couldn't help but love her. I tried to chase her, I really did. She was too busy looking at me when she dashed out into the road, and the bus didn't have time to stop. Sickening crunch, fell silent. I cradled her broken form in my arms, too numb to weep, too hurt to move. All I could feel was the warm crimson liquid gently seep into my clothes. In the state of shock I was in, I could just think about how I was going to wash my jeans. It sounds horrid, I know, but a loss like that tears everything away from you and leaves you with only the bare thought process that make us human. The next week was a blur. I cannot place a single memory to a time. In between friends and family extending their condolences, and the howling sobs of mine that would break out at any moment, I attended her funeral dressed all in black. By dressed, I don't mean merely clothes. My very essence was dark. I couldn't feel or think, and the day continued as I went through the motions, like a dying man treading water. Everyone wanted to tell me about Sam, and how perfect she was, what an angel she was, as if I didn't know, as if I didn't realize what a gift my own daughter was. The man stood out from the rest as he walked up to me and handed me this large leather book. I assumed, at the time, he was a parent of one of Sam's friends, handing me a collection of their photos together. Or maybe I was too numb to even process his cold hands, and how he never mentioned my daughter once. For a month, I was lost. I drank, and stayed in our now empty apartment alone, watching old box sets, too numb now to even cry. It was only when my sister arrived, when she held my hand and talked to me, that I began to come out of my shell. She'd sit and listen to the most inane things I said, and gently coaxed me out of my depression. Not completely, but enough for me to begin to live what was almost a real life again. That was when I opened the book. I decided to remember Sam for all the joy she gave, and was prepared to reflect on her life without feeling miserable. I opened to the first page. It was essentially a binder full of Polaroid photos of my daughter growing up. I furrowed my brow. They were taken from a distance, blurred slightly, and I was in a few of them. I began to feel sick, but hoped that the following photos would provide some explanation. I came up with every excuse of how the man obtained these photos. Desperate to view the moments of my daughter's life without a sense of trepidation. The photos grew closer and closer to my daughter's birthday. I could see the day I gave her a tiny bike after she turned 5, and the skinned knees that ensued. The book had so many more pages that I assumed the rest were empty. But there was a photo of her just before the movies on her 6th birthday. I could recognize the pink raincoat she insisted on wearing, and my hands on her shoulders. There was no photo of the crash. Instead, her life continued inside this book. Her 7th birthday had a photo of me and her in the garden, covered in paint, with a huge canvas on the floor and an extremely messy painting. Her 7th birthday. Her 7th birthday. The reality of what I was seeing hit me then, and I slammed the book shut. I sat there, at the kitchen table, staring at the leather. This must be some sadistic Photoshop, I hoped. Someone had taken the time to pull a horrid prank on me. I say I hoped because essentially I couldn't believe the other explanation, if there even was one. Gritting my teeth, I decided I had nothing to lose and kept reading. I can't explain the emotions I felt whilst I read accurately, listening to the sound of the page turning. I can try, but nothing could prepare you for something like this. Her life continued, showing her losing her baby teeth, her first day of senior school. My turning of the pages became more frenzied, and I began to notice something. The photographer was getting closer, closer to her. As she grew older, not in every photo, but a general trend, the photographer was getting closer and closer. More daring, perhaps. She was beautiful, stunning. As a teenager, she looked just like her mother, all curls and smiles. I grew older too, but the photos began to include me less and less. Her 16th birthday was strange. A group of her friends sitting outside, drinking from little plastic cups at a picnic. But there was someone in the background. Near the bushes of the park where this was taken, a dark figure stood. You wouldn't have noticed him, if not for the small shadow he cast on the grass. I leant back for a moment and exhaled. This was too weird. I'd been so caught up in watching my little girl grow up, I hadn't thought about how this would end. Moments like this are so utterly surreal that sometimes you remove yourself from them. I almost felt like I was watching myself read these, like this was a dream or a program on the television. I continued. The dark figure became more and more present in each photograph. I could almost make out features. His presence was towering, and as I turned the page I expected to see him disappear. But instead, as the photographs grew closer to her 18th, each birthday was marked by a caption underneath the Polaroid saying, "Another year." She was no longer somewhere I recognized. Instead, the photos were of her in a dimly lit house, her face contorted by fear, striking all sorts of weird poses. Sometimes she would be dressed like an ancient queen, or she would be dressed like a maid scrubbing the floors. The figure was there even closer now. His legs or his arm would appear in each and every one. No matter how she was dressed, in every photo her face had this desperately pained expression. It killed me. There were bruises on her face. She looked thin, ill even. I couldn't do it. This was sick, properly sick, my girl. I soldiered on. The last photo I looked at before I slammed the book shut and swore to never, ever look at it again was of her 18th. The caption underneath read, "At last," in sloppy writing. She was looking straight at the camera, crying. She was on her knees, dressed in a black evening dress, with an apple in her mouth, and her hands bound behind her back. Her makeup was ruined by her tears. It was as if she was pleading me, begging me to help, but I couldn't. I closed the book and left the room, my whole body convulsing with sobs. I couldn't call the police, of course. She was dead. The thing that keeps me up at night isn't the content of what I saw. It's that there were so many pages left,